The two, they will have 15 minutes each for their addresses. Roberta is a professor of economics, so she brings more of an economics perspective at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the University of Pavia. Roberta has worked extensively in the economics of innovation, economic development, regional economics, as well as on global value chains, and more recent work on green global value chains and their economic geography. Also, very importantly, both of them have done very influential work picked up by international organizations. They have both worked extensively for international organizations like the ILO, UNIDO, UNCTAD, OECD, etc., etc. So also the network aims to develop policy-relevant, theory-driven and evidence-based insights to support public policies and shape policy conversations on these topics. Without any further ado, I would leave the floor to Stefano. Stefano, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thanks, Riccardo and colleagues, and thank you to the RSA for inviting me to be here with you. And really the ask from Riccardo and the RSA was essentially to bring me to reflect upon what global value chain and regional development, regional study scholars can learn from each other, and what kind of collaborations can be put in place to build a common agenda together. So this started yesterday at the workshop of the new Green Global Value Chains for Sustainable Regional Development. I said it right? Okay. Networking and continues today. So value chain analysis is really simple from a point of view of understanding what the focus of the research is. We follow products from ideation, design, inputs into production or processing, international trade, reprocessing, all the way to consumption, and then with some recycling of materials if one takes a circular economy process. The key is, and what defines us differently from supply chain management, which is a more technical approach to that, is that we look at issues of governance, regulation, upgrading paths, and more importantly to me, power relations and resulting inequalities as these products go from production to consumption, in my own case, usually with a north-south component. So there are important territorial dimensions in global value chain and regional value chain work, and we are also in constant dialogue and exchange with our colleagues that are more on the economic geography field of the global production network scholarship, like Neil Coe, Henry Young, Henderson, Lotte Thompson here, Martin Hess, etc. So we're not new to economic geography, but I don't think we have we have engaged explicitly with some of the regional dimensions, except for some work that now is looking at regional value chains. So we are interested in local and regional dynamics and impacts in relation to the functioning and restructuring of global value chains. And my own work actually started in development studies, looking at the livelihood impacts in very specific places of agricultural markets liberalization in East Africa back in the 90s. And then I moved on into a much more vertical approach, following commodities from production to consumption, because at that time, when I was looking at livelihoods, I was like, yeah, now we understand these dynamics, but we don't really know where the push or the pull comes when these products leave those particular areas. And so I think that what we are interested in common here is to try to understand the imbrication of vertical and horizontal dynamics as we look at either global value chains or segments of them. And so I chose not to put the global there because I think there's much more than that we can talk about. I'll do two interventions today. One is a reflection on why we should care about green and greening value chains. And the two are different. So green value chains are value chains about green products and services. Greening value chains are value chains of other products that are quote unquote normal, but then we're trying to make them more environmentally friendly. in an era of geopolitical tensions and fragmentation, where the decarbonization agenda is also being, and the environmental agenda more generally, the green agenda, has been challenged. And so what then kind of insights value chain analysis, including the green part, can provide in view of better explaining current dynamics, challenges, and opportunities in a fragmented world. So those are the two things. I only have another 10 minutes available, so I'll be quite helicopter view here. In the question and answer, you're welcome to ask for more details or examples. When I do come into examples, my background is mostly in agri-food value chain, so I'm tilted on that side, and I will give you some of those examples, but Roberta covers a lot of other ground, so the two together, I think we're going to be able to cover a bit of everything. All right. Now, nobody can really question the fact that there is a green backlash taking place, and it's not just the Trump administration version 2 and friends, geopolitical friends of the hour, and it's not just about how, on what side of the bed Trump is going to wake up, and therefore what kind of tariffs are going to be imposed on friends and not so friends, but it's also the sort of backlash that is happening in the EU with the EU omnibus and the rethinking about of the Green Deal today. The last version came out with a right-wing majority pushing for a much watered-down deal. So that is taking place. Does that mean that we need to walk away from this research agenda? My argument is not. And it's based on essentially my primary research, talking to business people from the CEO suite all the way to farmers. And the reflection that business responses are actually mixed when you go out and talk to them. Some business are indeed moving away very fast from greening because maybe they were latecomers, maybe it's too expensive for them, maybe it's not politically really palatable. But others are actually now hiding behind their green credentials. They do greening, but they don't tell anyone because they're afraid of political backlash. Doesn't mean that is not taking place, especially if these are companies that are that have a first mover advantage and have put in a lot of sunk investment into greening processes. We heard this morning, for those of you who were here, that green job creation is taking place, very richly so in some areas, like the southwest of the US for solar, western Denmark for wind. They just are not in the same places where some of the job losses in so-called sunset industries are taking place. So again, a mixed picture there. And the issue of green competitiveness, especially in relation to China, and not just renewables, but also electric vehicles and batteries, is not going to go away. And so even if we don't talk about green, China is going to go its own way to be establishing a competitive edge. Okay? So we are indeed in a crisis of globalization. Not that we like the globalization very much, especially from an inequality perspective, but that is what is happening. There is a process of fragmentation. There are territorial reconfigurations are indeed happening, there's no doubt. But actually, some of the key vulnerabilities that are seen from a geopolitical perspective and some of the supply chain choke points that we are observing are enmeshed into key green or greening value chains. So even if we take a geopolitical perspective, I mean, 5 years ago at CBS, my institution, nobody talked about geopolitics except for the people who did international political economy and political science. And I asked my colleagues, and they've always done that. And it's so important for them, has been forever. Then you look at the publications, not so much. But I mean, okay, you know, we all also follow some of these trends. Now, the politics of reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring production opens up also new possibilities, especially in relation to the imbrication, again, of global value chain and regional studies. There is, and there has been, macro-regional level decarbonization and sustainability certification processes. They have been taking place for quite a long time, and they came a bit into a crisis in the great sort of globalization of sustainability in the 2010s. And now, because that is being driving back a little bit, I think that the kind of a regional and more local dimension is coming back into being more important, because certain parts of Europe, for example, they still want to kind of move forward with that agenda. Now, if we talk about sub-regional, sub-national regional processes, there's a lot now that has been going on and is being reconfigured in terms of regional green valorization processes. I'll come back to that in a second, because my latest work is on wine, so I'm a bit biased on that side. And I will use maybe a couple of minutes, if I have them, to cover that. Climate change, okay, whether it's not going to go away. Decarbonization issues in the long term and biodiversity preservation is not going to go anywhere, and therefore our research agenda needs to stick to that, no matter what the latest fad is. Now, a couple of challenges and then a few opportunities for value chain, regional studies people to sit together and try to understand what are the issues and what can we do. I'm Italian, I'm gesticulating too much. So, now, what happened, especially in the last 20 years and up to, I would say, 6-7 years ago, is that the great advance of global sustainability certification systems and codes of conduct and ways of measuring environmental impact effectively delinked green concerns from local and regional social and environmental conditions and dynamics. In one industry after another, we were told that you can use this, a green certification or another, and you can apply it wherever you are. And that created a lot of problems. And in parallel to that, we also saw the same kind of thing happening in some geographic indications of origin and appellations, in which, because of their market success, they needed to expand, and so Prosecco became from one small area close to Treviso into the whole of the northeast of Italy. Same geographic appellation. Is it the same local? Of course not. Many other examples like that. So another challenge is that with climate change, what is considered to be sustainable today in place, in specific places and regions, may not be in the future. And it's already happening. They are not quite the same, those kind of concerns. So examples, and I'll come back to that on the wines examples in a second. So climate change challenges the traditional authenticity and heritage foundations of geographic appellations and terroir in wine, in cheeses, in any of these areas in which the whole valorization of place is based. We've been doing this for a long time. This is how the natural conditions and the craft that is being developed by local people come together and provide you a product or a set of services like tourism that is unique, and therefore you can valorize that from a regional perspective. Well, the champagne wine that you're drinking today doesn't have the same acidity they used to have 10 years ago because of change in temperatures. The season is shorter, they have to harvest earlier, they harvest faster, so they need to have more labor and for a shorter time, all sorts of interactions also with labor dynamics and labor regimes. Wines that today are considered to be traditional in a particular style, they will not be, and they are not. In my area, I have a holiday home close to Valpolicella, and the Amarone that you had 20 years ago is not the Amarone that you have today. Okay? The alcohol levels are gone over the top because of high temperatures, and at the same time, you keep it less in the barrels in the bottle because the Scandinavians want to have something rounder and softer. Okay? So what is tradition, what is heritage within that? So the market is changing, climate change is changing, and yet you're still having these kind of discourses about local valorization process as if they were set in time and unchanging, as opposed to being constantly changing and part of constant readjustment. On top of that, and that is quite obvious for people who work in agri-food, climate change challenges the fundamental agronomic and financial feasibility of agri-food production. Beyond the regionalization, valorization process, coffee that is now grown on the lower slopes of Kilimanjaro is not the same coffee that used to be. In about the last 20 years, the movement of what is possible to be done on the mountain has gone up by about 100 meters in altitude. There is a national park on top. You can't move into higher altitudes. So from a local perspective, you are looking at something that is going to disappear in time. From a global perspective, if I'm an international coffee trader, to which we have a project on this with Janina Grabs, you ask them, and they're like, oh, so what? I'm going to buy it somewhere else. But if you are in that particular location, then that is really fundamental to your survival. 2? Perfect. Last slides. So what are the opportunities, both analytically, but also in terms of policy or institutional involvement for our communities to come together and develop new ways of thinking, or bringing in some other ways of thinking with a new spin? And part of it has to do with it's not the embedding, but the re-embedding, because that was historical already there. Nature, the environment, craft, social conditions of production in more specific places and regions. And so I'll give you a couple of examples from wine, okay? I worked a lot in South Africa, partly in Italy. There's a certification on heritage vineyards in South Africa. These are vineyards that have been planted 35 years or older. And there is a whole profile, the kind of wine, especially in Chenin Blanc, that comes out of those. And that valorization process is basically bringing grape prices to those farmers that are 400% what they would get if they sold the same grape on the normal market. And the idea is that you sell nature in place. I mean, these are rooted, and they're rooted in those particular places, in that particular soil, and tended in a particular way that gives you something that is unique, and is that not just a heritage, but it's the heritage in that place, okay? So they're bringing back some of that, and also they are more resilient to climate change. There are lots of place-based valorization processes that can be brought in from regenerative viticulture and biodynamic wines. Again, not in terms of having Demeter saying this is a biodynamic wine, but is that biodynamic wine has that particular location, that particular characteristics, because in that particular location, not just the geographic indication, but the uniqueness of that place. So at the same time, I think that there is a need to move away from essentialization and romanticization of the past that is currently embedded in, for example, definitions of terroir in appellation systems. Climate change is really changing that, and a new system needs to come in place, and in particular the Italians that I talk to institutionally, they're putting their head under the sand. They don't want to hear that, and they don't want to do anything about it. The French are a little bit more open. And in this particular sector, I think that there is potential analytically and in practice to revitalizing certain kinds of wine tourism. Wine tourism is a great thing in terms of, again, regional and local valorization systems, but in the past 10 to 15 years, it has become something that a lot of tour operators are offering in very commercialized and very branded ways. And so they go to these places, but it's all a kind of a charade of place as opposed to a real valorization engagement. Thank you. If you want to know more, you can download this book or come to the discussion after this in this room. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefano. Without any further ado, I would leave immediately the floor to Roberta Rabellotti, please.
Okay, so thank you very much for being here. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today. I'm very glad for this invitation. It has been quite a long time I haven't been to an RSA conference. Last time was in Florence in a roundtable organized by Simona Iammarino. So I'm really glad to be here. And I'm also very happy to be able to be part of this launch of this new initiative on green global value chains for sustainable and regional, regional development. So my presentation is, takes a different angle, but somehow quite complementary with respect to Stefano, in the sense that what I would like to do is to try to show you the implication of adopting a GVC lens in understanding the challenges and opportunities of regions with respect to the green transition. So the title of my presentation is How the Green Transition is Reshaping Opportunities and Challenges in Global Value Chain and Why This Matters for Regions. I hope you will forgive me because for some kind of internal misunderstanding, I prepared my slide yesterday night, and so they are not as flashy as Andres' slides this morning. So they are a bit boring, I'm sorry. And let me also say that my talk will be mainly referring to renewable energies. And if you were at the previous section on green global value chain, there was some very important work presented by Riccardo Crescenzi and some co-authors showing that green global value chains is not only renewable energies. So there is a lot beyond renewable energies. But I would like to say that renewable energies is fundamental for the green transition. And it's fundamental because we know that it is crucial for addressing climate change, but also for those who do not believe in climate change, is also fundamental in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, which are having a really huge adverse impact on global health. So what I'm going to say is relevant for renewable energies mainly, but of course it has also some implication for our green global value chain. So let me start from three facts. The first one is that we need more green innovation. The green transition needs more green innovation because we need cheaper, more efficient, and more environmentally sustainable green technologies. And there is some evidence provided by the International Energy Agency showing that for meeting the 2030 climate target, we already have all the green technologies we need. But if we want to meet, and I'm not sure about that, the 2050 climate target, we will need green technologies which at the moment are still at the prototype or demonstration stage. So the second fact is that this development of green technologies is creating huge economic opportunities. There are some estimates about the dimension, the size of the market of global green technology, and this estimation says that it's about $2 trillion in 2024, and it will grow to about $10 trillion by 2030. And the third fact is that green innovation remains highly geographically concentrated. There is some evidence from the OECD pointing to the fact that between 2017 and 21, nearly 80% of green patents have been filed in 6 countries only, and primarily by large private firms. So I think it is very clear the impact of this geographical unevenness in terms of increasing social and economic regional inequalities. And it's also important to say, and it was very well shown in the morning by Andres, that is not only a problem of social cohesion, it's also a problem of political legitimacy. And I think that this is also very clear to everybody in these days. So, the question I would like to address is, can more countries and regions seize these green windows of opportunities? And how can the GVC approach help in that direction? So from the point of view of the renewable energies, what I have done in some previous work is to emphasize and to distinguish within the renewable energy industry into two distinct chains. There is a manufacturing chain, which means focusing on the production of key equipment, and there is a deployment service chain, which involves all the services needed in terms of distribution and utilization of energy. Why is it important to distinguish between manufacturing and services? This is because there is this tendencies of always concentrating only on manufacturing, but it is true that services tend to create more jobs than manufacturing, and also in the specific case of renewable energies, more value is aggregated in services with respect to manufacturing. If we simply take one example, a solar 100 megawatt plant, about 30% of the cost to produce, to install this plant can be attributed to manufacturing, and about 70% can be attributed to deployment or to services. So let me give you to introduce two key characteristics of the green technologies, because these are important in terms to understand how regions and countries can take advantage of these green windows of opportunity. The first characteristic of the green technology is that these technologies are still relatively novel and experimental, which means that there are still windows open, and there is still space for new entrants. These windows are closing rapidly, but they are still open. And the second important characteristic is that these green technologies are characterized by a double externality, which means an externality related with R&D, but also environmental externality, and which means that there is a key role in terms of policy. And when I mean policy, I mean policy, a multi-level policy, so policy at different levels, which means global, which means national, but also means local and regional. What is the recipe for participation and upgrading in green global value chains? Of course, there is not one recipe. There are many possible combinations, but what I would like to say is that the participation and upgrading is the result of the interplay of policies and different mix of policies with different characteristics, different local characteristics. And through this interplay, countries or regions can participate in value chain, which means they can, for instance, set up the manufacturing of some components, and they eventually can also upgrade, which means, for instance, capturing more value through the production of more complex components. The outcomes of this interplay vary by industry and also vary by country and by regions, and it's fundamental to take into account the characteristic of a local ecosystem, which implies taking into account the capabilities of local companies, which means to take into account the characteristic of the local innovation system, the presence of foreign investors, the quality of the education, the quality of infrastructure. So, let me give you, and it's going to be very brief, don't worry, it's just one slide. So let me present you very, very rapidly the finding from one recent paper I published in the Journal of International Business Policy. I think that some of the findings are interesting because what we have been doing is to identify possible combinations of mixes of policies together with different type of local conditions. And in this case, the empirical setting is a sample of 12 middle-income countries in 3 different industries. So what are the main findings? The first one is that participation in green global value chain is widespread both in manufacturing and in services. But when we come to upgrading, this is much more prominent in deployment chain than in manufacturing chain. And the reason for that is that, first of all, services are more stickier, they are much more localized. And secondly, the economies of scale are less relevant as in manufacturing. And there are, from the south, there are a lot of interesting cases. One case is Costa Rica, a very small country in Central America with a very strong engineering base, which have been able to build up a very strong industry offering services, advanced services of maintenance in wind industry, which is now which Costa Rican company now sold to all the region. So there are more opportunity for smaller countries. Something we also investigate is the substitution between policy and local condition, and the complementarity between policy and local condition. And we found some interesting findings, but I don't have the time to present you. I think I have to rush. So let me come to the role of regional local policy. As I was saying, policy are fundamental, and in particular, regional and local policies play a very important role. If we take the example of European Green Deal, there are some estimates showing that the implementation of about 70% of climate mitigation measures take place at the local level. And for climate adaptation policy, is about the 90%. And there are some interesting examples. So I don't have the time to get into the example, but for instance, there is a very interesting example of a collaboration between the municipality of Gothenburg and Volvo, which has been key in terms of the capacity of Volvo to develop the initial capability in terms of electric buses because of a local public procurement at the level of municipality and then at the level of the region. So I only have 2 slides. So this is from the New York Times yesterday. And so what this article says is of course, on the COP, and is saying the United States is out. Europe is struggling, but emerging countries are embracing renewable energy thanks to a glut of cheap equipment. And guess from where these cheap equipment are coming? They are coming from China. And there are some nice examples. For example, Nigeria, an oil country which is building up the largest solar panel production company in the world. But let me go, and I will conclude with that, to China. China is the elephant in the room. China leadership in green technology, I think, is very interesting from the point of view of regional and local policy, because it shows and illustrates a very successful collaborative industrial policy combining a strong national direction with local initiatives. It combines subsidies at national level with a very broad policy mix combining local green public procurement, local public venture capital, local experimentation project. And these strategies have been supported by a successful vertical integration between different government levels and horizontal cooperation across firms and institutions. So we know China dominates the solar manufacturing chain and is starting to gain more and more space in the wind energy value chain, where the EU still retains some advantage. So I think that to preserve its position in green global value chain, Europe must respond rapidly, consistently, and with innovative, creative policies. And as far as I can see, this is not what it's doing. Rather, the policy is very uncertain. The targets are shifting every day. So I think this is something that we need to reflect on very seriously. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you very much. I think there is really a lot going on, and I think everyone in the network, but more generally in the regional studies community, can really be taking notes also on the intersection between geopolitics, environment, the political backlash. There is so much going on. I would really like to leave the floor to my three co-organizers of the network for a brief comment on these fantastic talks, and then we will open the floor for 2 questions, and then for a very, very short response by our speakers. The first co-organizer is Valentina De Marchi from ESADE. Valentina, please, I'll leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riccardo. Thanks, Stefano and Roberta and everyone. I think what you shared was clear to make evident to everyone to what extent sustainability, in particular environmental sustainability, right, and global value chains are two needed lenses that we need to look at. It's important to address environmental issues, and it's important to take a global value chain perspective in order to capture the full implications, right, of these issues. I want to raise 2 elements and 2 comments that I think are connecting with both greening global value chains and green value chains, right? 2 different perspectives that we saw right now. The first is about the role of tensions, trade-offs, paradoxes, we call them in the management literature. If we want to really understand the full potential of greening value chains, we need to live with the idea that we are going to identify, we need to find ways to deal with several tensions across different environmental dimensions, tensions across environmental, social, and economic dimensions, but also tensions related to the different actors that are engaged into these dynamics. We could take a single individual, a country, company's perspective, but then we will need to ask the question then who will gain and who will lose, right? And what are going to be the tensions that are going to emerge, at least on the short term, right? Or even maybe in other temporal dimensions when we want to address and look at the environmental and the social and economic dimensions. So I just want to point attention to this aspect, because we have been moving from a very positivistic and even naive versions of we need to go green will create jobs, green will save Europe and its politics, to a complete backlash where from the political agenda, as was clearly emerging, that's something that we want to, in a way, hide away. And I think we need to move into a middle ground where we are aware that we need to go there, but that's not necessarily easy. And so that's important to put at the center what are the challenges, the tensions, and to find solutions to navigate them. Because yes, we're not going to solve them, but we have to find ways to navigate. And the second very short point I also want to add then is that of interdisciplinarity. the complexity of what has been described, which is connecting environmental, social, economic, geopolitics, right? We cannot deal that with one only discipline. And I think it's very nice that initiatives of launching a network that has that aim to bring together different disciplines. And yet, we know that despite, as academics, we receive many pressures also to be more interdisciplinary, we know that walking that path is not that easy, right? So I think maybe also we should start thinking more and more, how can we really do interdisciplinary research that can be aware of the specificities of the different disciplines, of the different incentives that people, part of different disciplines have, and yet finding ways to find out the most of what each discipline is able to do to inspire others in order to find solutions to those really big issues. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Valentina. Caroline Fulke, very own LSE colleague. Please, Caroline. We didn't find another Italian, so that...
Yeah, sorry, I'm German. Okay, yeah, so being very aware of time, thank you for these very insightful, inspiring talks. And I think there's really not that much, I think, to add, but I think I would like to make 3 quick points that are maybe a little bit more on the meta level, challenging us as researchers and how do we think about this big research agenda. Obviously, we all know it's super important, but maybe from a perspective of more the bigger questions on how do we actually theorize around this research agenda. And that links also to what we have discussed in the network yesterday and today. So first of all, what does green and greening actually mean, and how can we give this catchphrase that we hear all the time some actual meaning from an academic perspective? So how can we back it up with theory so that it doesn't become an empty word that is just reproduced? And then also, how do maybe the languages that we use around greening and also sustainability differ across disciplines, but also across spaces. So maybe when we talk to farmers somewhere in remote rural areas, that understanding is very different from when we talk about it here, and that probably also determines our research outcomes. And then secondly, maybe because you are established scholars who have pushed a lot like conceptual understandings that we use in value chain research, do you think that we need to engage a bit more systematically on how do we need to maybe theorize back to understanding these concepts differently when we take this approach of greening value chains? And we discussed, for example, in how far is upgrading a relevant category in that, and how can we again give upgrading in that idea of green upgrading a bit more meaning? How can we bring in the downgrading that might be associated with upgrading simultaneously? Questions around valuation, but also devaluation. And then also, what does this mean for power on different levels? And the last point is also the kind of old story, but I think is very relevant, is the question, for whom is this happening? By whom is this happening, and where? So I would personally promote a bottom-up approach where we really look at case studies and how these dynamics differ across these case studies, specifically putting regions of the Global South in the center of the debate, because these regions obviously face the highest burden and the highest costs of adapting to climate crisis, and also to these big changes in governance that often comes from the Global North, where they have to react to and adapt to, but they are at the same time the least responsible historically for the climate crisis. So how can we bring in these perspectives and possibly also theorize back from these perspectives in how we discuss greening and green value chains? I think I will leave it like that. Thank you.
Finally, last but not least, Oliver Harman, Oxford University and LSE.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you all, and thank you to the speakers. I am responding live very much to these comments, and to help you believe that I'm responding live, I'm going to frame my comments around the sartorial choices of our 2 speakers today. And also, if you'll believe me, I'm going to repeat one thing that Carolyn said, so we definitely would have coordinated on that if we weren't responding live. Firstly, to Roberta's jumper, I think there is an important, indeed, Caroline just mentioned it, this kind of consideration of green versus greening. I think we need to understand a little bit what are those thresholds for what makes something green and sufficiently green to avoid some of these difficulties that might come with a lot of greenwashing. I think kind of greening is maybe clearer, but of course you can be greening certain parts of the value chain as other parts might be browning, which leads on to the kind of second part of Roberta's jumper, which is, at least from my view, the brown versus browning value chains. And I think that's also some consideration we need to be taking and thinking on, like what are these value chains that are in fact going the other way, and at what parts on that kind of value creation or destruction is that happening. I also think there is also a little role for, and I'm trying not to stretch this metaphor too much, but the kind of greening the blue economy, so to speak. I think there's huge amounts within that we need to sort of consider. And of course, conceptually, I need to be a little bit careful here, but there is some kind of gray value chain, something that's in the middle, right? These sort of ones that aren't necessarily destructive to the environment and to sustainable growth, but somewhat in the middle. So that was kind of my reflection there. To Stefano's shirt, which at least up close has a lot of nature and natural capital on and biodiversity, I think this is also kind of a really critical part of this dialogue around green global value chains, because it is the kind of nature and the natural capital that is often the very start of that kind of production process. And I think what's quite unique when we consider this in the regional sense is how spatially bound some of this nature and natural capital is, in a way that some of our other inputs into the value chains are maybe less so. I was just at the Royal Horticultural Society in Wisley recently, and they had this beautiful exhibition on the pharmaceutical industry, which we think is a little bit more of a global industry, but was showing all of these different kind of plants that form a lot of the drugs that we take today that are very spatially bound in where they are often produced and kind of harvested. And I think we can extend that more classically. We think about things like critical minerals that are going into that production function in a different way, or even, as we will often talk about, like pear production. There's some regions, particularly in Argentina and Rio Negro, who are have these huge regional comparative advantages in pear production that I think feed into this process, this value chain process. As I was eating a pear earlier, I was kind of considering that. The third one is not to do with anyone's sartorial choices, but I just think it's a consideration on the kind of different types of spatial socioeconomic consequences from the different types of greening. I think this is kind of, we've often discussed these value chains with respect to firms, but when we consider this regional angle, different types of, greening can have these different consequences in space. When I often reflect on, for example, green FDI and hydroelectric, firms typically have to cluster around those hydro plants because of their power intensity, which builds different agglomerations to, and we were talking about this, one was kind of presenting on some of this stuff this morning, to what Felipe was presenting, hydrogen, right? I think different renewable energies decay with distance in different ways, and it's going to have consequences for the way that, kind of our agglomerations and our clusters set up. I had written down a few other comments, but I know there are some questions, and I'm quite keen to open it to the floor rather than hearing more from me. So I'm going to stop there and pass it back to Ricardo.
Thank you, Oliver. So we don't have time, but we have time for 2 questions. I know Simona is booked. Please, okay, yes, the two of you. Can you shout? Because I don't think there is time to find them.
I will shout. Thank you, first of all of you. I mean, obviously, Roberta and Stefano, but all the organizers of this wonderful session that I enjoyed a lot. I just have one question, Roberta, because you mentioned, and it's already a few years that I hear this China elephant in the room. But as Europe, I hear, and I don't know if I'm the only one, that Europe wants to decouple from China. How do you see this? What can we do? Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. We have another question.
Yeah, hi, my name is Raj. I am a student at the University of Stavanger and also students of Ricardo and Caroline. Thanks for the great presentation. I really appreciate the Global South perspective as well from the commentators. I have a question that also reflects the global perspective. On one side, there is a great opportunity for green innovation, but also, as we noticed, there's heavily concentration in some of the countries. So I'm worried that some countries are significantly better placed to reap the benefits than some other countries. How can we make sure that especially the growing countries, the least developed countries, have equal opportunities and they're not further away from being able to even start plugging themselves into the global value chain? Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Our speakers have really 1.5 minutes. Fortunately, the network is 3 years long, so we have 3 years to answer. But please, Roberta, do you like to start?
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. I mean, maybe a word on China decoupling. I mean, I think that China has clearly shown us that this decoupling is not possible. I mean, it was, for the moment, it is not possible. I think it's not also in the interest of the green transition. I mean, and it's not in the interest of, apart from Europe, also from the rest of the world. And I think that, I mean, I think what is happening in the COP in this day is quite interesting because really many emerging countries are taking the lead of this green transition, which is quite different from what was happening a few years ago. And of course, and I think your point is very, very good, of course it's not for every developing countries. I mean, I've been trying to discuss what is needed, so this capacity in terms of policy mixes, not every country has it. The local conditions are not everywhere, but I think that the let's say, the advantage or one of the advantage of this value chain approach is to be, is useful in terms of digging into these combinations. And this is what we have tried to do at country level and which will be extremely interesting to do at regional level.
Thank you, Roberta, fantastic.
I think
Stefano, please.
Roberta actually answered both questions. So
no, but there were also...
Well, I could go back to one point that Caroline made. It's a very important one because what is happening at the analytical and theoretical level is a bit problematic, and I think you kind of brought something out that is quite interesting. So much of the research now is looking at green and greening processes in trying to understand what does it do to processes of governance and upgrading or inequality. But it's not making us rethink some of these analytical categories in different ways theoretically. And I think that's probably the next step. The second point you made, or that was your first, that is important, I think, is about the meanings and the narratives and the language that we use, or our actors, the actors that we study, use in relation to green. In the Wine book, I make an argument that green discourses don't exist. Not one green discourse, there are at least 6 empirically that I found, and they are so different that essentially it's the difference between greening that is what is politically important in terms of research, as opposed to green versus brown. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefano. Also on behalf of the co-organizers of this network, I would like to thank Stefano and Roberta for their fantastic talks, everyone who participated, and please stay tuned for news on the network and its activities. Let me just emphasize it is an open network, so it's really an initiative that tries to bring in people from the RSA community, but also connect with other communities and reach out outside our community. So we really look forward to a fruitful interaction with the RSA community in the years to come. Thank you very much.